Family traditions are peculiar things, passed down through generations with their origins often forgotten, their meanings blurred over time. In the Mitchell family, our Thanksgiving tradition was painfully clear, a rigid hierarchy determining who ate first and best. I always found myself at the bottom of this food chain, served last when little remained but dried out turkey edges and the scraped remnants of mashed potatoes. I'm Rebecca Mitchell, though no one in my family ever uses my full name. It's always Becca or Bex, diminutives that seemed to reflect my diminished status within the family structure. My older brother Thomas was the golden child. Harvard Law, perfect wife, twin daughters, and a corner office at a prestigious Boston firm. My younger sister Zoe was the family rebel whose artistic endeavors were initially dismissed, but eventually celebrated when her photography started appearing in glossy magazines. And then there was me, the middle child with the sensible accounting job, the small apartment in the unfashionable part of town, and the perpetually empty chair beside me at family gatherings. The Thanksgiving hierarchy wasn't subtle. First served was always Grandpa Mitchell, family patriarch and retired judge, followed by my father and uncles in order of age. Next came my mother and aunts, again by age, then Thomas and his wife, then Zoe, then the grandchildren. I, inexplicably, was always last, after even my teenage cousins. No one ever acknowledged this pattern. It simply existed as fact, like gravity or the New England winters. "It's just turkey, Becca," my mother would say whenever I hinted at the unfairness. Does it really matter who gets served when? But we both knew it wasn't just about the food. It was about worth, about visibility, about belonging. It was about watching everyone receive the choicest portions while I waited. My empty plate a reminder of my place in the family order. 3 years ago, I nearly skipped Thanksgiving altogether. My long-term boyfriend had just ended our relationship with the crushing explanation that he needed someone more exciting, and the thought of facing family questions about my perpetual singlehood felt unbearable. But Aunt Helen had called, insisting I come. "The family needs to be together," she said firmly. "All of us." Aunt Helen had always been something of an enigma in our family. My father's younger sister had never married, pursuing instead a career in international diplomacy that kept her abroad for much of my childhood. Her appearances at family gatherings were rare but memorable, often punctuated by heated debates with Grandpa Mitchell about politics or philosophy. While not exactly warm, she had always treated me with a respect that felt notably absent from other family interactions. So despite my reservations, I found myself driving to my parents' suburban home that Thanksgiving, unaware that the family tradition of serving me last was about to be dramatically upended, and that Aunt Helen's seemingly small act of rebellion would cascade into revelations that would transform our family forever. The Mitchell family home sat on 2 carefully landscaped acres in a wealthy Boston suburb, a colonial-style house that had been extensively renovated over the years, but still maintained its traditional facade. Everything about the property spoke of old money and conservative values, from the American flag permanently displayed by the front door to the formal dining room where Thanksgiving was always held, with its heavy mahogany table and uncomfortable high-backed chairs that discouraged lingering over meals. Grandpa Mitchell had presided over this domain for nearly 50 years. At 82, his physical presence had diminished, his once imposing frame now slightly stooped, but his authority remained absolute. His judicial career had instilled in him a belief in strict hierarchies and unquestioned respect for traditional structures. These values permeated every aspect of family life, creating an atmosphere where achievement was celebrated, but only along prescribed paths. My father, Edward, had followed closely in his father's footsteps, becoming a corporate attorney whose client list included some of Boston's oldest financial institutions. He viewed the world through a lens of rules and expectations, approaching parenthood with the same methodical evaluation he applied to legal briefs. Thomas, with his conventional success, received his highest praise. Zoe, after initial resistance, earned reluctant approval once her rebellion yielded recognizable success. I remained an enigma to him, neither rebellious nor exceptionally successful, just steadily competent in ways that never quite registered on his scale of accomplishment. My mother, Catherine, had abandoned a promising academic career when she married my father, channeling her intellectual energy into maintaining the family's social standing and serving on various charitable boards. She loved her children, but her affection was often expressed through concern about our adherence to social expectations. My sensible career and modest lifestyle seemed to both relieve and disappoint her. I would never embarrass the family, but neither would I enhance its prestige. Thomas had internalized the family values completely, viewing his life as a series of achievements to be checked off a predetermined list. His wife Diane came from a similar background, and they were raising their daughters with the same emphasis on external accomplishments and social conformity. Zoe, in contrast, had explicitly rejected these values, moving to New York immediately after college and establishing herself in artistic circles that viewed our family's conservatism with amused disdain. And then there was Aunt Helen. 10 years younger than my father, she had been something of a family anomaly from the beginning. Her career with the State Department had taken her to embassies across the world, from Tokyo to Cairo to Berlin. Unlike other family members who measured success through acquisition, houses, cars, club memberships, Helen's accomplishments existed in a realm beyond the family's easy comprehension. She spoke multiple languages, had negotiated international agreements, and moved through the world with a confidence that needed no external validation. Her relationship with Grandpa Mitchell was particularly complex. He was simultaneously proud of her professional achievements and uncomfortable with her independence. Their interactions often carried an undercurrent of unresolved tension, a clash between his need for control and her refusal to be controlled. I had always observed these family dynamics from a careful distance, neither conforming completely nor openly rebelling. My accounting career satisfied the family's expectation for respectable employment while requiring minimal engagement at family gatherings. Still working at that same firm, Becca? Was typically the extent of career discussion directed my way, in contrast to the detailed inquiries about Thomas's cases or Zoe's latest exhibition. What no one in the family seemed to recognize, or perhaps care to acknowledge, was that my boring career gave me insight into aspects of their lives they might prefer to keep hidden. As a forensic accountant specializing in financial investigations, I had developed a particularly nuanced understanding of how money revealed people's true priorities and secrets. This professional skill had led me to notice certain irregularities in the family's historical financial arrangements, inconsistencies I had never felt empowered to question directly, until that Thanksgiving 3 years ago, when Aunt Helen's unexpected gesture would crack open the carefully maintained facade of Mitchell family dynamics. I arrived at my parents' house exactly 17 minutes before the mandated 3 p.m. Thanksgiving gathering, late enough to avoid extended pre-dinner small talk, but early enough to prevent my mother's disapproving comments about punctuality. The familiar knot of dread tightened in my stomach as I parked behind Thomas's Mercedes SUV and Zoe's rental car. The house smelled of sage, butter, and the subtle undercurrent of family tension. My mother greeted me with a quick cheek kiss and immediately handed me a stack of cloth napkins to fold. "Thomas and Diane are in the living room with your father and grandfather," she informed me, already turning back to her gravy preparation. "Zoe's running late as usual. The twins are in the den watching a movie. No questions about my drive over or how I was doing after the breakup she knew about. Just immediate assignment to household tasks, as though my primary value lay in napkin folding proficiency." I worked quietly, listening to the murmur of conversation from the living room. My father's deep laugh, Thomas's confident tone as he presumably described some professional triumph, the twins occasionally giggling at their movie, the familiar choreography of family roles unfolding exactly as expected. When the doorbell rang 20 minutes later, I knew it would be Aunt Helen. She was the only family member who didn't use her key, a small but deliberate maintenance of boundaries I had always admired. "I'll get it," I called, grateful for the excuse to postpone joining the living room congregation. Aunt Helen stood on the porch holding a bottle of expensive scotch, not the typical Thanksgiving offering, but entirely in character. At 63, she remained striking, her silver hair cut in a sharp bob that framed high cheekbones and observant gray eyes so similar to my own. "Rebecca," she said warmly, using my full name as she always did. "How wonderful to see you." Her embrace was brief but genuine, unaccompanied by the usual family assessment of my appearance or status. "I didn't know you were coming this year," I admitted as I took her coat. "Mom didn't mention it. Last-minute decision. I wrapped up negotiations in Geneva earlier than expected." She studied me with her diplomat's gaze. "You look tired. Everything all right?" The simple, direct question nearly undid me. After months of carefully maintaining my composure through the breakup, job stress, and looming family gathering, having someone actually see me felt dangerously close to an invitation to fall apart. "I'm fine," I managed, the Mitchell family's default response to any inquiry about well-being. Helen's raised eyebrow indicated she recognized the deflection but wouldn't push. "We'll talk later," she said simply, then handed me the scotch. For after dinner. I suspect we might need it. The next hour proceeded according to the usual holiday script. Zoe arrived in a flurry of artistic energy and impractical city clothes. The twins performed their well-rehearsed blend of academic and athletic accomplishments for Grandpa's approval. Thomas held forth about a recent case while Diane smiled supportively. I circulated with appetizers, occasionally fielding questions about whether I was seeing anyone new yet. Through it all, I noticed Aunt Helen watching the family dynamics with the same analytical attention she likely brought to international negotiations. Her gaze lingered on Grandpa Mitchell, who seemed more frail than at our last gathering, but no less commanding in his patriarch role. When they directly engaged, their exchanges carried decades of unspoken history. "Still got that house in Cambridge, Helen?" he asked during a lull in conversation. "I do," she replied evenly, "though I'm rarely there with my travel schedule. Seems wasteful, property that valuable sitting empty. Perhaps, but some things are worth maintaining even when their value isn't immediately apparent." There was something loaded in this exchange that I couldn't quite decipher, a subtext that caused my father to suddenly become very interested in his drink, and my mother to suggest it was time to move to the dining room. As we took our customary seats around the formal dining table, I automatically headed toward my usual place at the far end. Aunt Helen surprised me by taking the chair beside mine rather than her typical spot near my father. "I prefer this view of the table," she said when I raised my eyebrows questioningly. The Thanksgiving serving ritual began exactly as it always had. Grandpa Mitchell received the first portions of everything: the choice turkey slices, the fluffiest mashed potatoes, the center cuts of pie. My father followed, then my uncles, mother, and aunts. Thomas and Diane were served, then Zoe, then the twins. The serving dishes made their way down the table, contents diminishing with each passing, until finally, predictably, they arrived at my place with little left worth taking. As I prepared to serve myself the remaining scraps, something unprecedented occurred. Aunt Helen reached over and placed her own untouched plate, laden with prime turkey slices, a perfect scoop of potatoes, and rich gravy, directly in front of me. Then, with deliberate movements, she took my empty plate and handed it to the server for the remnants. "I find I have less appetite than I thought," she said calmly, though her expression made it clear this was no mere whim of portion control. The table fell silent. This breach of established order hung in the air like a thunderclap, made more shocking by its simplicity. It wasn't just the action itself, but the clear intentionality behind it, a public rejection of the hierarchy that had shaped our family gatherings for as long as I could remember. Grandpa Mitchell's fork paused halfway to his mouth, his eyes narrowing as he assessed this small rebellion. My father cleared his throat uncomfortably. Thomas looked bewildered, as if Helen had suddenly started speaking in tongues. And in that suspended moment, as all eyes moved between Helen's composed expression and my plate with its prime turkey slices, I understood that something fundamental had just shifted in our family dynamic. The simple act of giving me her plate had challenged an unspoken system that had diminished me for years, and Aunt Helen had done it knowing exactly what it would symbolize to everyone present. The silent tension following Aunt Helen's plate swap was broken by my mother, who launched into an overly bright description of the cranberry recipe she'd discovered. The conversation resumed its normal rhythm, but the ripple effect of Helen's small rebellion continued to spread through subtle reactions around the table. My father kept glancing between Helen and Grandpa Mitchell with barely disguised concern. Thomas looked confused, as if trying to process a disruption to the natural order he'd always taken for granted. Most intriguing was my grandfather's response. His jaw had tightened momentarily, but instead of the stern disapproval I expected, he studied Helen with what appeared to be wary respect. As dinner progressed, I noticed other undercurrents beneath the surface of family conversation. When discussion turned to Thomas's recent promotion, Aunt Helen asked pointed questions about the firm's overseas investments that made my brother unexpectedly uncomfortable. When Zoe mentioned her upcoming gallery showing, Helen expressed genuine interest, while my father made a dismissive comment about those art world people, revealing a tension I hadn't previously recognized. "Speaking of investments," Grandpa Mitchell said during a lull, his eyes fixed on Helen, "I suppose you've heard about the Westfield property development." The seemingly innocuous comment caused a subtle but noticeable reaction across the table. My mother's hand froze midway to her water glass. My father suddenly became very interested in cutting his turkey into precise pieces. "I have," Helen replied evenly. "Quite the ambitious project. Breaking ground next spring, I understand." "Good opportunity," Grandpa nodded. "Family's always done well with Westfield ventures." Something in his tone made me pay closer attention. As a forensic accountant, I developed an ear for financial discussions that carried hidden significance. This exchange clearly contained layers of meaning invisible to casual observation. Across the table, my young nieces had started a whispered conversation, giggling behind their hands. In the parental attention vacuum created by the Westfield discussion, their behavior went unchecked, another small disruption to family protocol. "Rebecca," Aunt Helen turned to me, deliberately changing the subject. "Tell me about your work. Any interesting cases lately?" This direct question about my professional life was so rare at family gatherings that I nearly choked on my borrowed turkey slice. Before I could respond, Thomas interjected with a laugh. "Becca just reviews paperwork all day, Aunt Helen. Not exactly riveting dinner conversation." "Actually," I found myself saying, surprised by my own boldness, "I recently led the investigation into the Harrington Bank fraud case, the one that made the Wall Street Journal last month." Silence fell again as family members processed this information. The Harrington case had indeed been prominent news, a sophisticated financial fraud scheme I had helped uncover, involving several prominent Boston families. "That was you?" my father asked, genuine surprise in his voice. "The paper didn't mention names." "We maintain client confidentiality," I explained, meeting his eyes directly. "But yes, that was my team's investigation." Aunt Helen smiled slightly. "How fascinating. Financial investigations often reveal much more than just accounting irregularities, don't they? They expose patterns of behavior, hidden motivations, sometimes entire systems built on deception." The way she emphasized these words, particularly patterns and systems, carried a weight that shifted the atmosphere around the table once again. I had the distinct impression she wasn't just talking about my work, but making a broader point about something specific to our family. Grandpa Mitchell cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should move on to dessert," he suggested, but his authoritative tone had diminished slightly. As the plates were cleared, I caught Aunt Helen watching me with an appraising expression. The simple act of giving me her plate had somehow altered the family dynamic in ways I was just beginning to understand. And I sensed that both the plate and the subtle references to my professional expertise were laying groundwork for something more significant to come. After dinner, the family dispersed according to long-established patterns. The men retreated to the study for brandy and discussion of serious matters. The children were sent to the den with dessert and a movie. The women gathered in the kitchen, ostensibly to clean up but really to engage in their own form of family politics, through carefully modulated conversation about absent relatives and community gossip. I was loading the dishwasher when Aunt Helen appeared at my elbow. "Rebecca, would you mind helping me bring in my overnight bag from the car?" I seemed to have tweaked my shoulder on the flight. Her perfectly functional shoulder rotation as she reached for a wine glass suggested this was a pretext, but I nodded and followed her outside. The November evening was crisp and dark, our breath forming small clouds in the porch light's glow. Instead of walking toward her rental car, Helen guided me to the stone bench at the far end of the garden, partially concealed by dormant hydrangea bushes. She produced 2 crystal tumblers from her coat pockets and the bottle of scotch from earlier. "I thought we could use a moment away from the Mitchell ecosystem," she said, pouring generous measures into each glass. "And I wanted to talk to you privately." I accepted the scotch, its peaty warmth a welcome contrast to the cold air. "About the plate swap? I appreciate the gesture, but you didn't have to." "That was merely a small correction to a long-standing injustice," she interrupted. "But it's also symbolic of larger patterns I'm no longer willing to ignore." She took a deliberate sip before continuing. "Rebecca, what do you know about the Mitchell Family Trust?" The question startled me. The trust was mentioned occasionally but never discussed in detail, particularly with non-essential family members like myself. "Not much," I admitted. "It was established by great-grandfather Mitchell, manages the family's old timber money and investments. Grandpa's the trustee, I think." Helen nodded. "That's the official version. But as someone who specializes in following financial trails, haven't you ever wondered about certain inconsistencies?" I hesitated, uncertain how much to reveal about my own observations. Over the years, my professional training had indeed flagged several questionable aspects of family finances. Vacation properties that seemed to materialize without clear funding sources, Thomas's Harvard education that coincided with a period of supposed financial constraint, the convenient timing of Zoe's scholarship to art school. "I've had questions," I acknowledged carefully, "but it's not my place to investigate my own family." "What if I told you that your place in this family, including that ridiculous serving order, has been deliberately constructed to keep you at a distance?" Helen's eyes were intense in the dim light. Because of all the grandchildren, you pose the greatest threat to certain arrangements that have persisted for decades. My pulse quickened. What are you talking about? The Mitchell Family Trust isn't what everyone thinks. Your great-grandfather established it with specific provisions that your grandfather has systematically circumvented for years. She reached into her coat and withdrew a manila envelope. This contains documentation I've gathered over the past decade. Banking records, property transfers, trust amendments with questionable provenance. I stared at the envelope, professional interest warring with family loyalty. Why are you showing me this? Because the trust provisions include specific requirements about fairness in distribution and ethical investment practices. Requirements that have been ignored in favor of preferential treatment and some rather dubious business relationships, including the Westfield development mentioned at dinner. She held my gaze steadily. And because according to the original trust documents, in the absence of a direct male heir with financial expertise, stewardship should pass to the oldest female descendant with such qualifications. The implication hit me like a physical blow. Me? You're saying that legally I should be the trustee, yes. Not your grandfather, not your father, not Thomas. You. Helen handed me the envelope, which explains why you've been systematically marginalized within the family structure, kept at arm's length, your professional capabilities downplayed, even serving you last at dinner. All part of a pattern to ensure you never look too closely at your rightful position. My hands trembled slightly as I accepted the envelope. This can't be right. Grandpa would never... Edward Mitchell Sr. is many things, but he's not above bending rules to maintain control, Helen said firmly. He's been doing it since he managed to wrest trustee authority from my mother, his older sister, 50 years ago, using the same tactics. The Mitchell men have always excelled at rewriting history to suit their preferences. I struggled to process this revelation. Your mother? But I thought that my father was the eldest? That's the story they've allowed to persist. The reality is more complicated, as family truths often are. Helen's expression softened slightly. Rebecca, I'm not asking you to confront anyone tonight. Just review the documents, apply your professional expertise, and draw your own conclusions. The truth about your place in this family is long overdue. As we sat in silence, the back door opened, spilling golden light across the patio. My father's silhouette appeared. Becca? Helen? What are you doing out here in the cold? I quickly tucked the envelope into my coat, meeting Helen's eyes in silent agreement. This conversation, and its implications, would remain between us for now. Just getting some fresh air and catching up, Helen replied smoothly, raising her glass. And enjoying your father's good scotch. As we walked back toward the house, I felt the weight of the envelope against my side, and with it, the first seismic tremor in the foundation of everything I'd believed about my family and my place within it. The remainder of Thanksgiving evening passed in a blur. I moved through familiar family rituals, coffee in the living room, polite deflection of questions about my love life, enduring Thomas's condescending career advice, but my mind was elsewhere, cataloging years of subtle dismissals and exclusions in this new, disturbing light. When I finally retreated to my childhood bedroom shortly after 10, I locked the door and spread Helen's documents across the faded floral bedspread. What I found confirmed my worst suspicions and revealed depths of family manipulation I hadn't imagined possible. The original Mitchell Family Trust, established in 1937, contained explicit provisions about ethical investment practices, equal consideration of all direct descendants regardless of gender, and a clear succession plan for trustee responsibilities based on financial acumen rather than gender or birth order. More disturbing were the documented amendments, some with questionable signatures, others with suspicious timing, that had gradually centralized control under Grandpa Mitchell and directed disproportionate benefits to male family branches. Most revealing was a property transfer from 1972, shortly after Grandpa assumed trustee responsibilities, that removed a significant Cambridge property from the trust and transferred it to his personal holdings. The same property he had criticized Helen for maintaining, which by rights should never have left trust ownership at all. I recognized the techniques immediately from my professional work: strategic amendments, selective distribution of information, careful maintenance of plausible deniability. Classic patterns of financial manipulation, executed with meticulous attention to legal appearances, while violating the spirit of fiduciary responsibility. Sleep proved impossible. By morning, I had constructed a preliminary timeline of trust irregularities spanning 5 decades. My forensic training had taken over, temporarily overshadowing the emotional implications of discovering my family's financial foundation was built on systematic deception. At breakfast, I watched the family through new eyes. Thomas discussing his recent bonus with my father, both beneficiaries of preferential distributions I now recognized as technically improper. My mother presiding over the meal service, an unwitting or willing enforcer of the hierarchy designed to keep me marginalized. Zoe, whose art career had been secretly underwritten by trust funds while being publicly attributed to scholarships and hustling. Only Aunt Helen met my gaze with full awareness, a slight nod acknowledging the weight of knowledge I now carried. "You look tired, Becca," my mother observed as she passed the coffee. "Didn't you sleep well?" "Just processing some complex information," I replied carefully. "Work stuff? On Thanksgiving?" Thomas shook his head with his usual condescension. "That's the problem with your field, no boundaries." I nearly laughed at the irony of his comment given what I'd discovered about his own career's financial underpinnings. Grandpa Mitchell studied me from the head of the table, his shrewd eyes narrowing slightly. "You seem preoccupied this morning, Rebecca." His use of my full name, rare from anyone but Helen, signaled awareness that something had shifted. The subtle emphasis he placed on Rebecca carried a warning note I'd never detected before. "Just thinking about family history," I replied, meeting his gaze directly for perhaps the first time in my adult life. "There's so much I've never properly understood." A flicker of something, concern, calculation, crossed his face before his expression returned to its usual authoritative calm. But the momentary crack in his composure confirmed what the documents had suggested. He recognized the potential threat I represented to the system he had so carefully constructed. As breakfast concluded and family members drifted toward their Black Friday plans, Aunt Helen approached me under the pretext of sharing holiday photos on her phone. "You reviewed everything?" she murmured. I nodded slightly. "It's worse than you suggested. The Westfield development appears to involve trust assets being used as collateral for a private venture. If it fails, the family could lose significantly more than they realize," she finished. "Exactly. The question now is what you intend to do with this information." It was the question I'd been wrestling with all night. Professional ethics, family loyalty, personal vindication, and practical consequences swirled in a complex moral equation. "I need more time," I said finally, "and more information before deciding anything." Helen squeezed my arm gently. "Fair enough. But remember, this isn't just about correcting past wrongs. The trust's current direction puts future generations at risk. Sometimes the greatest loyalty to family requires standing against its current leadership." As she moved away, I realized that Aunt Helen's simple act of placing the first slice on my plate had initiated a fundamental transformation, not just in how I viewed my family, but in how I understood my responsibility to its legacy and future. The weeks following Thanksgiving unfolded in a strange parallel reality. Externally, I maintained my regular routines: work, occasional social outings, weekly calls with my mother. Internally, I was conducting the most significant investigation of my career, meticulously tracing decades of Mitchell family financial manipulation. I approached the task with professional detachment, creating secure digital files, developing timelines, identifying patterns of disbursement that clearly favored certain family branches. The forensic accountant in me found grim satisfaction in mapping the elaborate structure Grandpa Mitchell had constructed to maintain control while creating the illusion of proper fiduciary conduct. The daughter and granddaughter in me struggled with the implications. 2 weeks after Thanksgiving, I met Helen at a quiet cafe in Cambridge, far from family surveillance. The location, 3 blocks from the property Grandpa had questionably transferred to his personal holdings, was deliberately chosen. "I've verified most of what you showed me," I began after we'd ordered, "and found additional issues, particularly regarding the education trusts supposedly established for all grandchildren. Mine appears to have been diverted to supplement Thomas's Harvard expenses." Helen nodded, unsurprised. "The pattern goes back further than that. Your father's Dartmouth education was partially funded with money that should have gone to my graduate studies. I ended up with scholarships and student loans while Edward had a fully paid experience. The personal cost of these manipulations suddenly became clear. Is that why you joined the State Department? International postings would keep you away from family gatherings?" "Partly," she acknowledged, "though I genuinely love the work. Distance provided perspective that would have been impossible had I remained embedded in family dynamics." She studied me carefully. "Have you decided what you'll do with this information?" I'd been wrestling with this question since Thanksgiving night. The legal path was clear. As a forensic accountant, I had a professional obligation to report certain financial irregularities, particularly those involving potential tax evasion. The ethical path was murkier, complicated by family loyalty and potential collateral damage to innocent parties. "I'm considering approaching Grandpa directly," I said finally, presenting what I've found and requesting voluntary corrections before taking more formal action. Helen's expression registered surprise followed by concern. "That's either very brave or very naive. Edward Sr. doesn't relinquish control willingly. I don't expect him to. But ethically, I need to give him the opportunity to address these issues before escalating." I hesitated, then added, "And I need to understand why. Why maintain this elaborate fiction? Why systematically minimize my role specifically? Some answers can only come from direct confrontation," Helen agreed. "But don't go alone. I should be there." We arranged the meeting for the following Saturday at Grandpa's house, under the pretext of discussing year-end family gifts. Helen would arrive first to ensure the conversation couldn't be easily terminated or deflected. The intervening days tested my resolve repeatedly. Twice I nearly called to cancel, questioning whether family peace might be worth more than financial rectitude. A surprise call from Thomas, suddenly interested in my expertise regarding an investment matter, triggered suspicion that word of my investigation had somehow leaked. Most challenging was my mother's midweek invitation to lunch, during which she casually mentioned how pleased Grandpa had been with my more engaged attitude at Thanksgiving. "He's always had a soft spot for you, you know," she said, rewriting family history with breathtaking ease. "Says you remind him of his sister." The reference to Helen's mother, the rightful trustee whose position had been usurped, couldn't be coincidental. This was reconnaissance, an attempt to gauge my knowledge and intentions. I maintained an outward calm while inwardly strengthening my resolve. The systematic gaslighting, making me question my own experiences of family marginalization, only confirmed the need for transparency. Saturday morning arrived cold and clear. I dressed with deliberate care, choosing a charcoal suit that projected professional authority rather than family deference. The documentation was organized in a leather portfolio, copies secured in multiple locations as insurance against potential disappearance. As I drove to the address where I'd spent countless family gatherings while never feeling fully welcome, I reflected on Aunt Helen's Thanksgiving gesture. The simple act of placing her plate before me had acknowledged my worth when the family system had long denied it. It was time to claim my rightful place not just at the dinner table, but in the stewardship of the legacy that belonged to all Mitchell descendants equally. Grandpa's imposing house came into view, Helen's car already parked in the circular driveway. Whatever happened in the next hour would irrevocably alter family dynamics that had persisted for generations. The weight of responsibility was enormous, but for the first time in my adult life, I felt fully prepared to bear it. The future of the Mitchell family, its finances, its relationships, its very understanding of itself, rested in the portfolio I carried and the truth it contained. Like Aunt Helen's plate at Thanksgiving dinner, I would place it squarely before those who had long denied its rightful distribution. Grandpa Mitchell's house, a stately Victorian that had been in the family for 4 generations, felt different as I approached it that morning. The facade that had always represented unquestionable patriarchal authority now appeared as what it truly was, a carefully maintained image concealing significant ethical compromises. Helen opened the door before I could ring the bell, her expression a mixture of support and warning. "He's in the study," she murmured, "and he's not alone. Your father's here too." This unexpected development complicated our strategy. We'd planned to address Grandpa directly, giving him the opportunity to begin corrective measures without wider family involvement. My father's presence suggested Grandpa was already preparing a united defense. "Does he know why we're here?" I asked quietly as we moved through the formal entryway. "I've said nothing specific, but he's no fool. 2 generations of marginalized Mitchell women arriving together for an unscheduled discussion. He knows something has shifted." The study door stood partially open, revealing Grandpa seated behind his massive mahogany desk, the same desk where trust documents had been signed and amended for decades. My father stood by the window, his posture betraying tension despite his casual Saturday attire. "Rebecca, Helen." Grandpa nodded as we entered, his tone neutral but his eyes sharp with assessment. "Edward mentioned you wanted to discuss family financial matters. I must say, it's unusual for either of you to take interest in such things." The deliberate diminishment, characterizing my entire financial career as unusual interest, would have silenced me in the past. Today it only strengthened my resolve. "Actually, Grandpa, financial analysis is quite literally my profession," I replied, setting my portfolio on the desk with quiet confidence. And after reviewing certain historical documents, I have significant concerns about the Mitchell Family Trust Administration. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. My father stepped away from the window, moving to stand beside Grandpa's chair in a visual display of allegiance. "What sort of concerns could you possibly have about matters well beyond your purview?" he asked, his attorney's cadence intended to intimidate. "Concerns regarding multiple trust amendments with questionable authorization, preferential distribution patterns that violate foundational provisions, and most recently, the pledging of trust assets as collateral for the Westfield development without proper disclosure to beneficiaries." I maintained steady eye contact, refusing to be cowed by his tone. Grandpa's expression remained impassive, but his fingers tightened almost imperceptibly on his armrest. "I see Helen has been sharing her peculiar theories again." "These aren't theories," Helen replied calmly. "The documentation speaks for itself. Rebecca has independently verified everything from professional sources." "And why exactly are you involving yourself in family business after decades of convenient absence?" my father demanded, turning his attention to his sister. "Because convenient absence was preferable to complicit presence," she responded with quiet dignity. "But some systems persist until directly challenged." Grandpa Mitchell studied us both for a long moment, his judicial expression revealing nothing of his thoughts. Then he reached for the intercom on his desk. "Sandra, please call Thomas and ask him to join us immediately. It seems we need a family meeting after all." The summoning of my brother, always the designated family defender, signaled Grandpa's strategy. Strength in numbers, the Mitchell men united against this unexpected female rebellion. As we waited in tense silence for Thomas to arrive, I mentally reviewed the evidence I'd compiled, the legal standards at issue, and the ethical principles at stake. Whatever happened next would determine not just the financial future of the Mitchell family, but whether truth and fairness could overcome decades of entrenched patriarchal control. Aunt Helen caught my eye across the room and gave me a slight nod of encouragement. Like the Thanksgiving plate she had placed before me, her presence now offered validation that I belonged exactly where I was, standing up for my rightful place in the family legacy. Thomas arrived 20 minutes later, slightly breathless and clearly unsettled by the urgent summons. His confusion deepened when he assessed the room's atmosphere. "What's going on? Is everything okay?" he asked, looking between Grandpa and our father for guidance. "Your sister has developed some concerns about family trust management," my father explained, his tone suggesting these concerns were somewhere between amusing and irritating. "Apparently she's been conducting her own little investigation." Thomas turned to me, his expression shifting from confusion to condescension. "Becca, you know this isn't your area. Trust management involves complex legal considerations beyond accounting principles." His automatic dismissal, so familiar and previously effective, struck me differently now. I didn't see the golden child whose approval I'd always sought. I saw someone who had benefited enormously from a system designed to favor him at others' expense. "Actually, Thomas, fiduciary responsibility and proper trust administration are precisely within my professional expertise," I replied, opening my portfolio. "I've prepared a summary of the issues identified, with supporting documentation for each point." I distributed copies of the summary document to everyone in the room. The three Mitchell men accepted the papers with varying degrees of reluctance, while Helen took hers with a slight smile of approval. The first section addresses amendments to the original trust documents from 1972, 1988, and 2003, I explained, my voice steady and professional. Each modification gradually centralized control while removing original safeguards regarding gender equity and ethical investment standards. These amendments were properly executed with legal counsel, my father interjected immediately. The execution may have met technical requirements, I acknowledged, but they directly contradicted the settlers' explicit intentions regarding trustee succession and beneficiary treatment. Particularly concerning is this provision. I turned to page 3 and waited while they followed, which was substantially altered to eliminate the requirement that trustee responsibilities be assigned based on financial expertise rather than gender or birth order. Thomas frowned, genuinely puzzled. Why would that matter? Dad and Grandpa have always handled the trust. That's how it works. It works that way because they systematically removed provisions that would have placed Helen's mother, and later potentially me, in positions of authority, I explained. The original trust was remarkably progressive for its time, specifically designed to ensure Mitchell women had equal financial standing and opportunity. Grandpa Mitchell, who had been silently reading through the document, finally spoke. "You've put together an impressive analysis, Rebecca. Clearly, you inherited the Mitchell attention to detail. His tone was almost appreciative, but his next words revealed his true position. However, these amendments were necessary adaptations to changing family circumstances and financial realities. Including the transfer of the Cambridge property to your personal holdings? Helen asked pointedly. The property my mother was using to generate income after her husband died? A flash of genuine anger crossed Grandpa's face, the first crack in his judicial composure. Your mother lacked the financial acumen to manage significant assets. I protected the family interests, as was my duty. By systematically disenfranchising the women in this family? I pressed, turning to the distribution analysis in my report. The education trust disbursements alone show a pattern of gender discrimination that would be indefensible in court. My father stood abruptly. That's enough. This family has always taken care of its own. If certain members received additional support, it was based on merit and need, not gender. The numbers tell a different story, I replied, forcing my voice to remain calm despite my rising emotion. And the Westfield development collateralization puts all beneficiaries at risk without proper disclosure or consent. Thomas, who had been reviewing the financial data with growing discomfort, looked up with unexpected seriousness. Dad, is this true? Are trust assets being used to secure the Westfield loans? The slight hesitation before my father answered told its own story. The Westfield opportunity required creative financing. The potential returns justify the temporary leveraging of certain assets. Without informing the beneficiaries or obtaining proper authorization, I added, which constitutes breach of fiduciary duty at minimum. The room fell silent as the implications settled. Thomas, to my surprise, continued studying the documents with a lawyer's focused attention, rather than dismissing them outright. Grandpa Mitchell finally closed his copy of the report and looked at me directly, his expression unreadable. What exactly do you want, Rebecca? Money? Control? Some form of retribution for imagined slights? The question was designed to diminish my concerns, to reduce principled objection to petty grievance. In the past, it would have worked, making me question my own motives and retreat from confrontation. Instead, I met his gaze steadily. I want restoration of the trust to its original provisions, professional independent review of all amendments and distributions over the past 50 years, and implementation of proper governance moving forward, beginning with acknowledgement of the rightful trustee succession based on financial expertise rather than gender. You're suggesting yourself as trustee, my father stated flatly. This entire exercise is a power grab. I'm suggesting adherence to the legally binding intentions of the trust creator, I corrected. And yes, under those original provisions, I would likely qualify as the appropriate trustee given my professional background. But this isn't about me personally. It's about correcting a system that has disadvantaged multiple generations of Mitchell women. Thomas looked between Grandpa and me, his legal mind clearly processing the potential ramifications. If even half of these allegations can be substantiated, we have a serious situation. The liability alone. His voice trailed off as Grandpa raised a hand for silence. The family patriarch studied me with new awareness, not affection or approval, but recognition of capability he had deliberately overlooked for years. You've certainly inherited the Mitchell determination, he said finally. What are your terms for keeping this within the family? The negotiation that followed lasted well into the evening, expanding to include video calls with key family members and consultation with independent legal counsel. By nightfall, we had established the framework for what would become known in family parlance as the restoration, a comprehensive restructuring of the Mitchell family trust to align with its original intentions while addressing decades of imbalance. The terms were substantial. Independent audit of all historical distributions with compensatory payments to address past inequities. Restructured governance with a family board representing all branches equally. Ethical investment standards prohibiting ventures like the Westfield development. And most significantly, implementation of the original trustee succession plan based on financial expertise rather than gender or birth order. This last provision meant that after a 6-month transition period, I would assume primary trustee responsibilities, a role I approached not as personal vindication, but as an opportunity to rebuild family financial governance on principles of transparency and fairness. The changes rippled through family dynamics in ways both expected and surprising. My father struggled with his diminished authority, but eventually found unexpected satisfaction in focusing on his legal practice without trust administration burdens. Thomas, after initial resistance, became a valuable ally in implementing proper governance structures. his legal expertise complementing my financial background. Most meaningful was the gradual healing between family branches that had been subtly pitted against each other for generations. Cousins who had been favored or marginalized under the old system began to interact as equals. Family gatherings, while still imperfect, developed a more authentic quality as artificial hierarchies dissolved. The following Thanksgiving marked the first family dinner under the restored trust structure. As we gathered around my parents' dining table, I noticed Aunt Helen watching with quiet satisfaction as the serving dishes circulated without the rigid hierarchy that had previously defined our meals. When my mother instinctively began serving in the traditional order, Helen gently intervened. "Perhaps we could try something different this year," she suggested, passing the dishes family style, so everyone can take what they prefer. The momentary hesitation that followed was broken by Grandpa Mitchell himself. In a gesture that acknowledged the fundamental shift in family dynamics, he passed the platter of turkey directly to me. "Rebecca should serve herself first," he said, using my full name with new respect. "As trustee, she's earned the privilege." I accepted the platter, recognizing the significance of this symbolic concession from a man who had spent decades maintaining rigid control. But instead of serving myself first, which would merely invert the old hierarchy rather than transform it, I passed the platter to my young niece seated beside me. "I think we can start with the youngest and work our way up," I suggested. New traditions for a new chapter. As the food made its way around the table, with each person serving themselves according to preference rather than position, I caught Aunt Helen's eye across the cranberry sauce. Her slight smile conveyed everything words couldn't. Acknowledgement of how far we'd come since she'd placed that first slice on my plate a year earlier. The simple act of serving me first had initiated a transformation far beyond dinner table protocol. It had challenged a system of inequality maintained through silence and tradition, demonstrating how small acts of recognition can ultimately lead to profound structural change. In that moment of shared understanding with Helen, I realized that the true Mitchell legacy wasn't financial assets or social position, but the courage to stand for fairness even when tradition dictated otherwise. A legacy I was now positioned to strengthen for generations to come. 5 years later, the Mitchell Family Trust finances a scholarship program for women pursuing careers in financial governance and ethical investment. At the annual award ceremony, Aunt Helen and I present the scholarships together, a living testament to what becomes possible when inequitable systems are challenged. My favorite moment comes when recipients sign the guest book below the program's simple but powerful motto, taken from the original 1937 trust document: "Value distributed grows, value hoarded diminishes. May this trust serve all equally." Thank you for experiencing at Thanksgiving. My family served me last, then my aunt placed the first slice on my plate. If this story about challenging unfair family systems resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever witnessed or experienced a small act of recognition that led to bigger changes? Or perhaps you've been part of challenging long-established family traditions that masked deeper inequities? Share your story. These conversations help us recognize patterns that might otherwise remain invisible in our own lives.